Sorry about that. A little late.
So that's another really good question. And Johnson is a pretty historic village as well. And I think there's a balance to be played, right? Like we do balance a historic structure versus the future lives of a resident. And I think at this point the consensus is the same, that all applications are going to be approved by the town's perspective and pushed off to Vermont Emergency Management. Right.
Great. Thanks, Tom. All right. I'm going to move on and have either Stephanie or Brian just kind of give a perspective of what happens once Tom and his team and the select board has approved an application and been passed on to Brian and Stephanie. What happens to those applications and what should folks be thinking about as they move into that next step?
Thanks, Sarah. Happy to give an overview. So as you know, we hear that the city is ready to go, and it sounds like we are near that point. We'll work with the town, with Tom to disseminate the forms to where they need to go. A buyout application entails a handful of forms, some of which each property owner will have to fill out, some for the town, and we would be working closely with the town to get those to the right parties and track those as we're getting those back and making sure we have what we need for a complete application. And so those are forms that ask some questions about, the history of the property, and documentation of location, lister cards, things like that. Photos, what FEMA calls pre-mitigation photos, just making sure we're documenting what's currently on the properties that are being applied for a buyout. And so again, we'll those requests will be coming to property owners from us or from the town, some combination, and we'll work with the town on getting those back. And at that point, we on the VEM side, we actually administer a few streams of funding that is probably needlessly confusing, and I won't go into all the detail here, although happy to dive into it a bit if it comes up on the questions. But depending on certain factors, like is the property in the FEMA 100-year flood zone or outside of it, but has other indications of flood risk, we on the VEM side, as we get properties in, would be doing the work of helping to sort those into the funding pot where they would be most viable. And then I think, once we have complete applications, once we have paperwork back and all the other documents, Johnson, submits the application, and it would go to our project review committee, which is a interagency committee that, evaluates these buyout applications as it relates to, indications of flood risk and other factors. And then from there, there's usually a 2-week review period on our end for the project review committee. And, assuming that they advance those applications, then they would go on to FEMA. And FEMA's process is a bit more of a black box. It takes them a while to process them, and we would work with FEMA to resolve any follow-up items that they identify, requests for information, working with the town where need be on answering those. But yeah, that's, I think, in an overview, the application process. And I don't know if we would want to go into what implementation looks like on the other end of that, or pause there and see if there's any questions about the application side.
Yeah, we have a first question. Let me open this up for April. I would love to kind of hear what things, somebody asked what kind of things should I be doing to prepare, like in terms of like putting together documentation, thinking about timeline, thinking about, what kind of financial burden is going to be on me, kind of those type of questions in terms of the application process. Like, what should I, if I'm interested in this, what should I be doing to prepare? Because it's, it's going to take some time, right? So what kind of things can I do to help speed the process up and be prepared to answer and present? April, I'll get to you in just one second, see if Brian, if you wanted to answer that, and then I will unmute you, April.
I'm happy to take it, Brian, either way.
Awesome. Oh, good. Thanks.
Excuse me. Oh, sorry. right when I said I'd take it.
Totally.
So yeah, I think it's a great question. And the thing that raised for me that we haven't talked about yet, that I think is important to make sure all of you know, is if you received some assistance, so if you received individual assistance from FEMA, or if you received a payment from the National Flood Insurance Program to fix your structure, FEMA within the buyout process sees that as a duplication of benefits. So I'm going to explain this. It's confusing, and please ask questions on it. But the example I'll give is, so if if your home was damaged in July, the purchase price will be based on an appraisal the day before the storm, so the value as of July 9th. And if your appraisal comes back at $200,000, and then you had $20,000 worth of individual assistance, the default for FEMA is to take that out of the buyout value. So we would offer $180,000 because they see that as we've already given you 20. Now you get 180. That makes you whole. If you use that money to fix your structure, which is if that's what it's intended for, you'll get it back. So the thing I want to make sure you're all thinking about is if you have a payment from FEMA, if there's something you need to do to make your home livable and you can use that money for it, do that and save your receipts. Because if you can show receipts for $20,000, you'll get the full $200,000. If it's receipts showing that you used that money to fix the structure. So hiring a contractor, when you went to Home Depot and bought drywall, whatever it is, save all of those receipts. I have a small human running around downstairs. I hope you can't hear that. But that's a big piece that I want to make sure, because there's a lot of confusion going around on that. Like, I shouldn't fix my structure. Well, if you have a payment from FEMA, you absolutely can, and you will get that money back if you do. So it's better to use it to fix your structure if you can, to make it livable, because it's going to take a while to get through the buyout process.
Thanks, Stephanie. There's one quick question from Jay. They're asking, does that include things like rental assistance or money to replace personal property?
Great, perfect question. Thank you for asking that. So no. So if you get a payment for rental assistance, great, keep that, use it for rent. It's only if it's money to fix your structure. So contents don't count, and rental assistance does not count towards the duplication of benefits.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. One more question, and then April, I promise I will get to you. What if you use the flood insurance payoff to pay off your mortgage?
Yeah, so the way the closing happens for these is the same as any other closing, where the bank gets paid first. So if you owe $200,000 and your value comes back at $250,000, you get $50,000 because the bank will get paid and you'll get whatever's extra. So if you pay down your mortgage further, you'll still get that back, if that makes sense. So if you now only owe $150,000, you'll get $100,000 back.
Greg, I'm going to let April go, just since she's been very patiently waiting her turn, and then Greg will get to your question. April, are you able to speak? I'm going to go with no, since I can't hear you.
Now can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great. All right. First of all, Stephanie answered one of my questions, and the other one is even more basic, because I know a lot of this paperwork can be confounding and confusing. And if someone is struggling with even the basics of completing the paperwork, to whom can they go to get support with that?
Yes, I offered this to the town, and I'm very happy to do this, which is to have Brian and I come up and sit in the town offices for a day and have people come and meet with us and talk through the application forms. So if that's helpful, we'll come hang out in the office for a day. The other thing that I think that will help with is that a lot of the forms need to be notarized. So if there's someone at the town office that can do the notary, then they can do it right there while we're filling forms out with you. So we're more than happy to do that if it's helpful.
Thanks, Stephanie. That's it for now. Thanks.
No, that's a great offer, and we can help facilitate that happening somehow in the grand scheme of things. So we will be in touch to make that happen for folks. Greg had a question. If you accept the buyout, are you able to remove or keep any of the appliances, countertops, or anything that's in the house? It's a good question too. Any answers to that one?
Yeah, so the FEMA answer is, and then I'll walk it back a little, just a touch. The FEMA answer is anything that's a part of the appraisal is purchased through this buyout. So they will say you can't take your kitchen light. I'm going to tell you, if you're attached to your kitchen light, no one's going to know that you took your kitchen light, take it. But the idea is if FEMA bought it, so everything should be demolished. That's a part of the buyout.
Great, thank you, thank you. If there's no more questions at this moment, there is, good stuff. Case, I think it's Casey, is property valued based on the assessed value or the fair market value? FEMA says it's fair market. It's a good question.
Yeah, so it's not the town assessed value, it's the fair market appraised value. So if you hired someone, a real estate professional, to come out and do an appraisal, that's what it's based on.
Perfect, thank you. Greg, I think the question is, will they go with the town tax appraisal or just the prior to the flood? So I think you've answered that. Do you want to just state that one more time, just so that Greg is clear?
Yeah, so it's not the tax appraisal, it's based on what that, if you'd hired someone the day before the storm to do, it's not the tax assessment, that's what it's an appraisal. So if you'd hired someone to do an appraisal the day before the storm, and it's going to be a bit of a forensics exercise for who's the person who's doing these to figure out what was damaged in the storm, what would the value have been before that happened.
Awesome, thank you. All right, Richard, I'm going to try to unmute you. Let's see if I can do that. Hey, Richard, do you want to try to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, did that work?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. My situation, my house is a rental property. And so I received funding from BGAP. Does that work the same way? Is it even in the equation if it's a rental property?
So it is in the equation. I think BGAP, I don't think BGAP would count against duplication of benefits because it's not for, well, it depends. If the money was to fix the structure, we might have to talk a little more about that.
Right, and I did fix the structure except for some skirting, which I have to wait till the spring because of the weather, but.
Yeah, and if you saved all your receipts, we'll look at those when we get to the end. And the other note I'll make about properties that have renters is that because the buyout is a voluntary process for the property owner, but it's not voluntary for the renter because they don't get a say in that. We don't own the property. It triggers it fell out of my head, Brian. Relocation assistance. You are right. There we go. Uniform relocation assistance. Thank you. Which is a federal program that allows us to then make a payment to the tenant. So there's specific requirements that go along with that about giving notice that this is happening at certain times, and we'll walk you through that process because we'll help put those notices out. But it does mean that we'll be able to pay the tenants some amount of money in this process.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
There was another question from Greg. If you didn't get your property appraised the day before the flood because you didn't know it's going to be flooding the following day, and we don't all go out and get our properties appraised on a regular basis, could we get it appraised now and use that as fair market value? Or how do you suggest, giving kind of an estimate for folks to use and understanding how much they may or may not be getting for their property?
Yeah, so you're right. No one went out the day before. So the state is managing the buyout program. So we will hire someone to do appraisals. They will come and talk to you and try and figure out what the value would have been on that day. So they'll do it retroactively. If you wanted to hire someone to do your own appraisal to get a better idea, you could, but we wouldn't be able to pay for that for the grant. You would have to pay for that yourself. But we'll have someone do an appraisal once the grant is awarded.
And Stephanie, is it going to be helpful if folks have kind of pre-flood photos of the house, kind of both interior and exterior, kind of to give a sense of what it looked like, you know, kind of the amenities of everything that's going on with the house? Is that something to think about for folks?
Yeah, if you do, that will be helpful, yes. So when the appraiser comes and talks to you, they'll be trying to build the picture of what it looked like. So yes, if you have any of that, it will be helpful for them.
Awesome, thank you. All right.
I do also, sorry, I forgot one other piece I was gonna say, which is that if your structure wasn't damaged, we can just do a current market appraisal based on the date of after we get the FEMA award. So it doesn't have to be a day before the storm value. It could just be, it's depending on the property. So for properties that were damaged, you'll get a higher value likely if you do the day before the storm value. But current market appraisals are also eligible. So it depends on the structure and if it was significantly impacted or not.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Other questions from folks about what we've heard thus far? All right. Just listening to what's happened thus far, Brian, before we go into the kind of the implementation, I wondered if Seth wanted to just add anything, if you had any other thoughts or hints that, you know, you just from your experience and where you're sitting, that you might want to share, and then we might move into Brian based on the questions that come up. Does that seem good?
Yeah, that sounds great. So one thing that I want to emphasize for folks is that I know a lot of you since July have been going through various FEMA processes and insurance processes, and that those have been very difficult to navigate, and there has not been for everyone a great amount of support and guidance. Something that I want to emphasize that's going to be different about the buyout process, if you choose to go through it, is that the folks from Vermont Emergency Management will work with you through the process to make sure you have the documentation. If there are gaps in documentation, they'll work with you to figure out how to close that gap. LCPC and Learn are available in our respective ways to help you figure out how to navigate this process. When you first get the application packet, it is going to have a lot of paperwork. It is going to feel a bit daunting, but you're not alone in that. If what the forms are saying doesn't make sense, if it feels like you're signing the same form just in different ways, please reach out and ask questions. And on that note, if you send in an application and it is incomplete or there are pieces missing, it goes to Stephanie and Brian before it goes to FEMA, and they will follow up. Might follow up with Sarah and I too to help fill those gaps before it goes to FEMA. So if you're struggling or feel like there are gaps because you've lost information in the flood, or you have difficulty recalling things because who expected to be in this situation, don't let that deter you. It's not going to be like individual assistance where you get a denial and then you're stuck in an appeal where you need an attorney. That is not how this process works. And Brian mentioned something called a request for information. That's a process where FEMA asks for more questions. Those might look like things that you answered in the application. They very, very often are. And again, we can all help you navigate putting sort of the language into terminology that will pass FEMA muster, and go back and forth a couple of times if that's what it takes. That first reaction to the lot of paperwork, that is absolutely true. It is unfair that people who are trying to go through this process have to deal with that. But you're not alone in dealing with that, and we'll help you walk through that.
Thanks, Seth. That's a really important thing for everybody to hear. My name and phone number is out there. My email is out there. If I can't answer the question, which I probably can't, I will make sure that we get in touch with one of these amazing people that can get the answer. If we need to send a case manager and somebody to sit with you at your home or at a location, we will do that. We know this process is onerous and hard and terrible and probably re-traumatizing, and we're trying our very best to provide as much support as possible to help you through it. So don't ever hesitate to use the phone numbers and emails that you have to get in touch with us. So thank you, Seth. That was a really good point. I saw that Greg had another question. His question is, who's responsible for the removal of the structures, and what is the time frame, if accepted, that one would have to be moved out? It's a good question.
Yeah, so the Vermont Emergency Management will be managing the grant, so we will hire a contractor to do the demo. So the town doesn't have to see that, the property owner, the property will already have closed, so you won't be there anymore. And in terms of the timing, and also Seth, thank you for what you just said. I really appreciate everything you just said. I think the hardest part for you guys, once you get the paperwork in initially, is going to be waiting and not knowing when you're going to get the award from FEMA. Even if we get requests for information, we will answer those. If there's something we need from you, like there's a photo missing of one side of the house, we might ask you for a specific photo, but you won't have to see any of that background information. It'll just be once we get the award. And I think the hardest part for you guys, again, will be that not knowing when that's going to come. But to answer the second part of that question, which was how quickly do you have to move out? So once we get the award, we're going to have multiple years before the grant has to be completed. So we'll have 4 years, 3 to 4 years likely at a minimum, where we can do the appraisal, we can start developing closing documents, and we're not going to kick you out of your house. This is completely voluntary until you sign at the closing table. So you can change your mind at any point until that moment. But we can also, if you say, I need 6 months to sort out where I'm going to go, then you get 6 months to sort out where you're going to go. So it's completely reasonable that you will need more time. The closing will be scheduled when it makes sense for you, as long as it's within that multiple year time frame.
Stephanie, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to clarify that 3 to 4 years includes a lot of stuff post, even once the property owner's out of there. It includes the demolition site work. It includes, closing out the grant. And so I just want to clarify, that's not the time frame for property owners getting out. But as Stephanie said, there is flexibility, once the appraisal's done and kind of the title search work and all those kind of just, checking off those boxes are done. The town VM will work with property owners to schedule that closing at a date that works for them.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan. Sean had a question, and he says, just to be clear, the appliances or things like beds, couches, refrigerators can be removed from the house before demolition.
So any of your personal items, absolutely. Beds, couches, yes. Where we get a little tricky with FEMA is appliances, because they were part of the appraisal. So we could make them not part of the appraisal, and then you can keep them. But I think we should talk about that on a more case-by-case basis as we get there, and we'll figure out how to help you through it. But yeah, definitely anything that's your personal effects, absolutely take all of that.
Right, thank you. Just in terms of kind of process that we talked about thus far, so folks have, Learn has, and LCPC has, the town has the initial application documents. If you're super inclined and you want to look at them and you haven't already seen them, let me know. We will send them to you so you can look at them. In that bunch of paperwork, there is one document that you have to do that is notarized. And when we send them out, we give you a list of all the different ways you can get it notarized. And if we can help you with that, definitely. That then goes back to the town. The town will then look at it and decide if they're going to approve it or not. It sounds like they're open to approving pretty much what comes to them within reason. And then that application then goes to Stephanie and Brian for you to kind of look at and decide what pot of funding. And then depending on what pot of funding it's assigned to, there's different processes for kind of what happens next. I love that the nods, that means I've gotten it all correct. So that's kind of the process thus far. Now, once you guys Brian, you talked about implementation. Do you want to dig in a little bit about what that means from the standpoint of the homeowner and the family and what's going on with that piece of the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have actually through these questions covered a lot of it. I mean, again, all that appraisal and closing document development, that all happens in the implementation phase when a grant's awarded. The grant is what covers the cost of doing that, so that we're able to do that and get that full market valuation as the basis for the purchase offer. So I don't know if I necessarily have anything to add, especially as it relates to, I know, this audience is more property owners. Like I said, there's some stuff in the implementation phase following the property closing for the town and VEM as it relates to the grant, but I think we covered most of the implementation as it relates to property owners, unless Stephanie, if you think I'm anything in that process that we haven't touched on yet.
No, I don't think so. I think the only piece I'll say, Sarah, to where you just ended on, which is us figuring out which program and where to take it from there, you won't feel any of that. So you'll submit just your homeowner packets, and then we'll ask you any questions, or if we're missing anything, we'll follow up. But then we on our end will work with the town to get the town forms signed. Brian will package everything as an application to go to FEMA. And it will go to one of two different FEMA programs, but it will look exactly the same for you, either way.
Awesome. Are there particular documents that folks should keep track of right now or start gathering that you know that they're going to need? So as they start this process, what could they be gathering and putting together kind of in a folder or in a place?
It's really the receipts. So if you received a payment from FEMA or other assistance to fix your structure, keep all of your receipts and keep them all in a nice clean place. When you have them in it, you can get them scanned so you're ready to send them to us. But we don't need them yet. We'll need them after we get the appraisal back. But just make sure you're hanging on to all of that, even if it's like scanning in a receipt from Home Depot, just to make sure it doesn't get lost. Make sure the date's on it. So the receipt isn't cut off. You can see what the date was and that it was after the flood. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. I also just wanted to point out to everybody that Dan, one of our representatives, is kind enough to put all of our representatives' phone numbers and emails in the Q&A. So if you want to talk to them about this process, feel free to reach out. Thank you, Dan, for noting that and putting that in the chat. Really appreciate it. Richard, go ahead. Feel free to unmute.
Yeah, it didn't come up this time. So can you hear me?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, cool. When the flood happened, as I said before, mine's a rental property. FEMA did nothing. Basically, I went up to the college, I met with them, and the outcome of it was, yeah, go over there to the Small Business Administration and see what they'll do for you. And I didn't do anything. I went through the BGAP. So is FEMA still in this? I mean, I applied for FEMA and I have a application number, but.
Yeah, so on the individual assistance, I can't speak to. So I don't know, Seth, if you have any guidance on that piece.
So Richard, that is a really good question and a really important question. And I'm going to apologize to all of you in advance, because to answer that question, I have to dive into some FEMA weeds. But FEMA has multiple arms and tentacles, and mitigation, where the buyouts come from, is a different arm or tentacle than the individual assistance and small business assistance that you have been working with. So it's best to think of it as a separate program that is mostly separate and independent of the applications you've made for individual assistance or flood insurance, with the small exception that Stephanie mentioned earlier about duplication of benefits. So if you've had a difficult time with individual assistance, yeah, if you have a difficult time with individual assistance or have not found FEMA to be responsive, you will have a team for support at the town and state level that is different than you had going through individual assistance. So I hope that answers your question. If you have those numbers and such, keep records of those. Anything you send to FEMA, keep a copy of it for yourself. I think if there's one piece of guidance, anytime you talk to FEMA, keep a record that it happened. But in this case, the town, LEARN, VEM, LCPC are all in your corner to help you through this process.
And I'll just say, for what it's worth, sorry, Richard, and then you can jump in, that none of you will be communicating directly with FEMA in this process. So this is the state managed program. Brian and I will be your state contacts. We'll talk to FEMA and we'll try to absorb as much of that
Yes.
on your behalf as you can, so you won't have to see any of that piece.
Richard, go ahead, and then we'll get to Sean's question. Can you unmute yourself, Richard?
Yeah, I think that answered my question. I just wanted to reiterate that FEMA the first time around wasn't very helpful. So we'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Richard. Sean had a question. How much time do you estimate between application approval and closing?
Yeah, so we're doing something we haven't done before, which I'm hoping will make it a lot faster. So Vermont Emergency Management is the one applying for the buyouts instead of having the town apply for it. So normally we'd have to get the award to the town, we'd have to develop a sub-grant agreement, they'd have to hire someone to do an appraisal. We're cutting all of that out of the process. So we will already have someone hired to do appraisals before we get any of these awards. So as soon as we get the award, we can send them out to do the appraisal. So that might take a month or two, and then closing document, we have to pull the title and do closing document development, and that can take 3 or 4 months. So that's probably the most time it'll take is 2 months, and then another 3 to 4. So maybe 6 months.
Great. That's much faster than I thought. So thanks,
Right.
Stephanie.
Yeah, it's faster than it's been. Again, I think the hardest part is going to be waiting once we get the application to FEMA, not knowing how long it'll take when we get the award.
I was going to clarify. I don't know if they're referring to application approval meaning on the town's end and then to us,
okay.
versus the actual award being made in that timeline. And so, yeah, Stephanie, if you want to kind of talk about FEMA's black box.
Yeah, so thank you, Brian. I heard that as once we get the award from FEMA. So once we get the award from FEMA, it's faster. If you're talking about when you submit the application form, so you'll submit the forms to the town, we'll roll them up into an application. As soon as that application is done, it'll go to our project review committee for 2 weeks. We'll finalize everything and get it off to FEMA within the next couple of weeks. So that it'll take a month or two, get it all cleaned up, sent to FEMA once we have the forms back from you. The trick is going to be that space between we've submitted it to FEMA. It's probably going to be a good 6 months before we start getting awards. It may take a little longer than that. And unfortunately, we don't control that process. So we'll make it as fast as we can to get it to FEMA, and then we'll have to wait, and then we'll make it as fast as we can on the other side. But it's going to take probably 6 months or more within FEMA review.
Thank you for that. I've gone through and allowed any of the participants to talk. If you guys if you wanted to unmute, if there's anybody who has a question and wanted to unmute and just ask your question, feel free to go ahead and do that. At least I've tried to. Technology and I don't always get along. And then go ahead. Please, go ahead, Greg.
Just to be clear, so if we were to, and we talked a lot tonight, if we were to go ahead and process the paperwork and you folks approved it, it went to FEMA and they approved it, how long from the time that they approved it would there be finances brought back to us so that way we can plan to build on to the next place we live on? I mean, people need to be prepared. So yes, we get approved. Now we got to find a lot, we got to find a house, we got to find something to be able to live on, and we want to know what the time frame with that would be so that we could. People can't take it out of the checking account. A lot of us used our bank and our funds to repair our houses after the flood, so we want to be able to know what our finances are going to be available to help start our new life.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that, Greg. Thank you. So once we get the award from FEMA, the first thing we'll do is have our person we've hired do the appraisal. So once we get that appraisal back, you'll know how much you're getting. So that's the first piece we'll do. And we went over the process a little fast, but what we'll do when we get the appraisal back is we'll look at a form that you're filling out now that says how much funding you received. We'll look at any receipts you have to make sure we're clearing the duplication of benefits. And then we'll develop what's called a voluntary transaction agreement. And that will be signed by each property owner with what the value of the structure is going to be. So how much we're going to pay you. So that clarifies if it's 200,000 minus 20,000 because you didn't have receipts, it'll do that math and show you 180. So you'll see what the amount is. And from there, we'll have an attorney pull the title, develop closing documents. And that'll probably take 3 to 4 months, but then you don't have to close right away. So if you're not ready to move out after 3 to 4 months of knowing how much you're going to get, you can tell us you need 6 more months. You can tell us you need additional time, and we'll work with you as long as it's within that full 3 or 4 years that we have to get this done. So I know that's not a perfect answer, but I hope that helps.
It does. I mean, we were just curious because with what you just said, we could stay here after we've received our funds.
No, so it's a closing like any other purchase.
Okay.
So you sit down at the closing table, you sign it, you get a check, and you're no longer on the premises.
Mm-hmm.
All right. It's just trying to plan that next part.
Yeah,
is going to be the kicker, because with the way that property has been, I mean, property values we've looked at property and you can't afford it anymore. Especially when individuals like ourselves have lived here forever, and you go to assess a new piece of property, you're looking at just for an acre of land anywhere between 50 and 100 grand, and then you got to stop and think about a dwelling. So for somebody to be able to start thinking that next step in their life, they need something like a chart written for us so that we know what's going on.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Sarah. Okay. Greg, thank you for asking that question and raising that issue. Something just to give a little more information for folks. That voluntary transaction agreement is part of the pile of paperwork that you are going to be doing at different steps of this process. But what essentially says is that this is a voluntary, this is something you're doing voluntary. If the appraisal comes back and it is not enough, you do have the opportunity to step out. If you run into challenges relocating, you do have the opportunity to step out of the process, because it is voluntary. Sending in the application doesn't commit you to the buyout if everything falls apart in your ability to make it work. Now, I'll also say to that in my experience working with VM on, another buyout where there were challenges for a property owner finding, another place to live, that communication with Stephanie and Brian about time, about scheduling of the closing, can be part of the process. And, you know, certainly, yeah, that's a very important question, you know, for folks. But if you send in that application to the town, you know, later this year, and events happen where it doesn't work out for whatever reason, you're not signed in if you're not signed in if factors happen that make it so you can't move forward with the buyout. And
I'm curious, Seth, of what, you know, Sean was going to ask my question. What happens if there's another, you say, you go through the process, you say no, because something comes up, before the check comes in, and there's then another flood. And then you decide maybe you wanted to do that. What happens to either your previous application? What happens for your prospects of getting another buy? Like what happens in that scenario where, you know, your house is flooded, and something comes up, you can't get the buyout for whatever reason? What happens the next time through?
Yeah, so there's no penalty. This is right now because of the scale of July. So one of the biggest funding programs we have is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And the amount of money that we get is defined by how severe the event is. So this is by far the most money we've ever had. Tropical Storm Irene was a fraction of what we're going to get following the July flood. So this is a good time to do it in terms of the amount of money that we have available. But there are other funding rounds. We've had, since Tropical Storm Irene, we've had at least one disaster round open every single year. With, unfortunately, for that meaning that we have a disaster almost every single year. But there will be other opportunities. The thing that you need to, if you want a day before the storm value, that needs to be applied for in this funding round. So if you want a day before the July storm value, you do need to apply under the funding round that we have open now. But that's not going to close until later this year. So there would still be time if you're on the fence now. But again, given the timing, if you're pretty sure you probably want to do it, I would get the forms in. And like Seth said, you can walk that back if you change your mind.
I think my question was more about if you are wanting to go through with the process and then and we're doing all of the due diligence and then another flood hits.
Got it. Okay. Thanks, Sean. So yes. So if you're doing a day before the storm value, that will be the same because that's still based on July 9th. So even if there's another flood between now and when we actually get to the completing of the buyout, the thing you'll need to pay attention to is the duplication of benefits again. So if there's a flood in June this year, we haven't completed the buyout yet, and you receive a payment from the flood insurance program, that also would need to be counted on your duplication of benefits form. So you'll just need to make sure you're keeping your receipts for any work any fixing of your structure that you do. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, Sean, I caught that way too late. So I'm glad you jumped in there. Good job.
Another thought I had is if we wanted to relocate sooner, and then rent out property until the buyout goes through, is that possible? Like if we were trying to relocate sooner than later, but still had to hang on to this house until the buyout goes through, but would be able to use it as a rental property in the interim?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think I've seen that particular scenario before. I think you would be able to do that. In order for a tenant to receive tenant assistance, they need to be there for a certain amount of time. So that tenant wouldn't be eligible for the tenant assistance if they move in closer to the buyout. But I think that would work. Let me look into that and I'll get something back to the town on it. I don't know, Brian, if you have we have an experience. I don't think we've dealt with this before. It's a good question.
I don't know if folks want to hear a little bit more about the tenant. I hadn't heard about the tenant support. I can't remember the word you used. I'm sorry, in the day. But are there particular kind of criteria restrictions that folks who are rental property owners might want to just kind of hear in kind of broad terms for those tenants that they have?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that it's an incredibly complicated program, and it's a formula that will involve we have to do an interview with the property with not the owner, an interview with the tenant to ask specific questions about their finances, to better understand their financial level and what they're paying for rent now versus some comparables in the area. So what they might be paying for rent if they would move somewhere else. And depending on the difference between those two, there's this whole crazy formula that spits out a number of how much money they would get. So it's really hard to tell how much exactly that will be until we're in the process. And so there's two payments. One is that sort of nebulous, how much more are you paying now, versus what is your income formula? And then funding to hire a moving truck, the actual moving expenses to get out of the structure.
And I think this is required because it's for tenants who are displaced by a project funded by federal funding. And I make that distinction because we know of a lot of instances where people were displaced by the flood, and then subsequently the property owner did the buyout. And unfortunately, this is not meant to be, this is not the kind of more broad assistance we need for renters in various places. But it's specifically if this buyout project is causing a tenant to be displaced, then they are entitled to go through this process per this federal law.
Thanks, Brian.
Stephanie, could I ask you a quick question about does the applicant and the property owner have to be the same name? And what happens when there's multiple owners on a deed, but yet a single applicant, or say a trust or life estate?
Yeah, great question. So if there are two names on the deed, those two people need to be signing the forms. Or whoever actually has the legal authority to sell the property needs to be the one signing the forms.
And then I think for everyone here, any of the forms that need to be notarized, please don't sign them before you're in the presence of a notary. You'd have to fill out the document again. It's a very formal process. It doesn't feel like it in real time, but for the notaries themselves, they take it quite seriously. There's 3 notaries at the town office. There's myself, Rosemary Audibert, and Susan Tinker. And at least one of the 3 of us can meet on site if needed, but we're always available if you call the office for those documents to be filled out and signed. But please wait to sign them before you're in the presence of a notary.
All right, it looks like Sarah's on the phone, so I will, I'll put it out there are there other questions that we've missed that would be helpful to get some feedback on?
Thanks, Stephanie.
Yeah.
One of our participants got cut off, so I just was trying to figure out if I could help him get back on. So are there other questions that folks have? I think most folks, I think you can just hop on, unmute yourself and ask the question.
So you said that people would be available to help fill out the paperwork and the applications for this, as my wife and I have started to try to fill out some of the paperwork, but there's a lot of questions about some of the questions being asked on the paperwork. So it would be best, I think, if somebody would be available to do that for everybody filling it out, just to make sure that mistakes aren't made and that the paperwork's filled out properly, so they're not coming back to us and prolonging the inevitable, so to speak.
Yep. No, duly noted. And I think what I'm going to do, Learn does have case managers. They're not as savvy as Stephanie and Brian are savvy on this process, but they're happy to help to the extent they can. But to your point, Greg, I think what we'll do next is Stephanie, Brian, and Seth will talk and see if we can find some times for you to be out in the the town office to be available. And once we have those set, we will let folks know. And we'll try to do that as soon as possible, of getting all the different people together. Does that make sense, Brian, Stephanie, and Seth? Okay.
Yes,
Great.
Thank you.
And Tom, we can work with you on getting some time scheduled.
Yeah.
If that works for you.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think I'd be happy to even do some multiple locations. So if people can't get out of their houses to
Yeah.
get to the town office, you know, happy to go to where you are as well.
Awesome.
This is kind of a question for Tom for the town. Is the select board going to be expecting that folks will have had a complete application all pulled together before acting on a request, or will you be kind of taking requests on a, you know, partial basis of paperwork?
You know, that's a great question. So the select board has seen a list of preliminary interest, and but I think the last communication was that there was a general consensus that all applicants would be accepted, and I think as early as possibly the 2/5 or the 2/21 select board meeting, that as soon as we had an application, I would just kind of have this running agenda item to review and approve the buyout applicants. So as soon as residents get them together, we'll get them on the agenda, and if there's no applicants, we'll just move on. But if there are applicants, it'll be there just in case to get it done. And I think
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. Jay, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you, Sarah. I don't know if any of you have an answer for this, but we're in the position right now where we can't live in our home, so we're paying rent and paying our mortgage. And I was wondering if there was any point at the process, like pre-closing, where we could trigger something that would maybe have our mortgage company stop making us pay a little bit. I'm just trying to figure out if the timeline is we keep paying our mortgage right up until the day we close, or if you know of any sort of wiggle room around that part of the process.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, because I can feel for that tough spot that you're in. I don't think I have a good answer for you. I don't know, Sarah, if there's something on your end that might be more helpful.
Jay, you are not the only person that has brought this up. This is something that is a running concern that every person I've spoken to has brought up. I have voiced this to our legislators. I have voiced this to Bernie Sanders' team and to Becca Balance team. I have voiced this to everybody I can think of, because it is a flaw in our system, that we would have to, you know, put homeowners in the position of having to negotiate with their mortgage companies, and totally out of power, don't understand what's going on, traumatized, and that they would have to continue to pay. I don't have a good answer. I know that our disaster relief fund is debating right now how we might be able to set up setting aside some of the funding to fill some gaps for folks as they go through this process. And at this point, that's the best we're being able to do, but we are in the process of figuring out how much that would be. And once we have that information, hopefully in the next week, we will let everybody know that that's kind of how we're going to provide a little bit of support. It is not a great answer. It is not the right way forward. And we, you know, I've been searching for some legal advice as well, and have brought that up with legal aid, and have brought that up with the Vermont Bar Association, as well as in terms of kind of, is there legal support for homeowners to help them think through and negotiate with the mortgage companies? And I have not gotten an answer to that as of yet. And as Learn, we are also trying to find a lawyer to put on retainer to help homeowners. And again, we have not found the right match of person yet, but that is in our works too. And so if any of those things come to fruition and we actually get those done, I will definitely let folks know. But you know, I don't know, Seth, if there's anything that you know of that folks, it's a really good question and a struggle in this process.
Yes, it is a gap in the system. You know, and as someone who's been part of the system my entire career, I want to apologize to every one of you that is a gap in the system. we're not supposed to lobby. So what I will say is if this is an issue that is causing many people hardship, I think that I saw your legislative contact information earlier. And that I can't suggest you make calls as lobbying, but if there's a desire to educate some of the people who I believe would be receptive, you might have seen that information earlier. So well, I'll also say that we are LCPC, VM are having conversations with folks about trying to find a way to fill that gap. We don't have a good answer for you now. And please keep asking that question because it's a question a lot of people are dealing with and that not everyone is, has been able to ask. And I wish I had a better answer than that. I'll, one note just, about where we are in this round at the moment to think about too for folks is, because there is this level of support right now because of the volume of people, dealing with this, both on big questions like that, and some of the other questions of just how do you get support to walk through these process. It's different than it has been after other disasters. And so there's, a critical mass both for getting the support administratively, but for raising some of these questions as well. And none of that is lobbying.
No, none of that is lobbying, but we appreciate
Yeah.
that.
I was
Thank you.
wondering if I could ask a quick question. Can you
Yeah.
guys hear me?
Absolutely. Please go ahead, Scott.
Right on. So my name is Scott, and I'm actually the floodplain zoning administrator for our great little town of Johnson. And a lot of the properties in Johnson that have flooded multiple times actually have land outside the 100-year floodplain. So there's been, the common sense approach is land is really hard to find right now in Vermont. We'd like to get rid of the building, but we have higher land that we could rebuild on. So for a buyout process, how is that managed? Would the property owner actually have to do a subdivision ahead of time, or how does that work? Because that question has come up.
Yes, and it's a very good question. Yes, it would have to be subdivided in advance in order for us to do that. So I don't know if there's a way LCPC and the town can connect on that and see if there's a way to make that happen or help facilitate that process.
Yep. And so the other part of this is with the buyout, if a parcel was cut off that was within the 100-year floodplain with the buildings that have been damaged, they have, they potentially could have land that's usable, but now they're landlocked. So they would need an easement or a right of way through the old property. How is that managed through VEM and FEMA?
So do you mean if we do a buyout on one property that someone needs to get through that property to get to their house?
Well, say it's the same property owner, because, I'm in the village, I'm outside the floodplain, but we have 3 acres of land, even though we're a village resident, so there's ample land. But if we were in the situation where we did have our house damaged and, thankfully we're up on the hill, we would need a right of way through the property that's being decommissioned or given over to FEMA, and that would be the way in. So how is that managed?
Got it. Okay. So generally through the buyout process, anything that's an encumbrance, like anything like well right of way or power lines needs to be cleaned up in the title search process. But if it's something like you need to be able to access the well that's on your neighbor's property, or you need it to get to your house, we can work around those. So if it's necessary for one of those very significant reasons, we can work around it. As long as it was subdivided in advance and that easement was in place.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Scott, thank you for bringing up that question. 2 things that I'd want to raise is, the issue you just raised of kind of a subdivision prior to an application is something that we are working through with a project in Cambridge. So Stephanie and I have been stumbling through figuring out how that works. It's a good question. It is definitely, something to consider. Along the Lamoille, because of past work that the town and LCPC has done, we can also provide a little more detail about where, the flood vulnerable areas are going to be to help inform where a subdivision like that might happen. Do want to make sure I have this right, that subdivision process, though, would be outside of the grant. So those expenses would not be covered by the buyout grant. A side piece, the flip side of that is, some of you might have properties that FEMA has not mapped as being in the floodplain that did flood. And you're kind of in a bit of a unique time right now, with, where there are, still ways at the moment to potentially work through that. So I know there have been discussions locally about the maps not being, accurate. If you're somebody who's home flooded, who is FEMA said is not in the floodplain, we can all work with you through that, through that process. It is more complicated when that is the case, but we're here to help you with complications like that.
Okay. Yeah, and I have one other follow-up question. So, and this is going to be a hypothetical, and for privacy reasons, if we have a house that was not gutted after the flood and has been just sort of sitting festering and could become a public health issue for our town health officers, waiting 2 years for FEMA to raise that house puts a lot of pressure on our public health officer and just the welfare of our community. How is that dealt with? Is there any kind of way to motivate that to be cleaned up or fast track to be taken down?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. Within the FEMA buyout process, anything that's part of implementation that happens before FEMA awards the project can make the project ineligible. So if someone were to demolish that structure prior to us getting the FEMA award, we wouldn't be able to do a buyout.
Yeah.
So that's a tricky little nuance that we get stuck in. The only workaround is if it's something like the house ends up in the river and it needs to be cleaned up because it's in the river, or if it ends up like in the town right of way, and if FEMA public assistance funding is used for debris management to clean it up, then that's fine, but we can't demo it in advance.
Yeah. And Scott, thank you for asking that question. That issue came up in another Lamoille County community, and the property owner took the initiative to remove the building because it was becoming a public health hazard. And unfortunately, the result of that is that they are not eligible for the buyout, and it's been an ongoing challenge. Again, there are gaps in this system that are not good for people on the ground. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being really clear with the answers, and I really appreciate your time tonight. It's been very beneficial. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. Howard, I don't know if it's Howard or Casey.
It's Howard.
Okay, awesome. Go ahead.
I got a question about, our home was not affected by either the July or December floods, but it was really close. And we have been flooded 4 times in the past. We have received FEMA floods and NFPA, NFIP insurance and all that sort of thing for these events. Is this a timely? Let me back up. We are investigating total buyout of the property, or mitigation of the property. And we would prefer mitigation because we really don't want to move. Are we eligible for any funds, whatever, under the federal programs for that?
Yeah, so by mitigation, do you mean like an elevation project?
Yes, abandoning the first floor of our building and hardening the building, letting floodwaters flow through. And moving all utilities and all that sort of stuff upstairs. Yes, that.
Yep. Yes. So elevations, yes, elevations are eligible. I'm watching Seth's face here because we've had some, they're complicated. FEMA does not make it easy to do an elevation project. And
FEMA doesn't make anything easy.
That is correct. Sorry, no comment.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of caveats that I'll give you as initial things to think about. One is BEM has a general fund allocation that we're using to cover match for buyouts. We're anticipating additional funding, but that's not a guarantee at this point, and we're only covering match for buyouts. So for most elevation projects, there's a 25% match requirement. So FEMA will cover 75% of the costs, but we don't have enough funding within our own state program to cover elevation match. So keep that in mind. Unfortunately, it makes it easier to do a buyout than to elevate a structure, but it is possible. It's complicated. It's also possible to do a relocation project where you're buying the land and then moving the structure somewhere else. The easiest way to do that is if it's a mobile home that's structurally sound enough to be moved. If it's any more complicated as a structure, that's not going to necessarily be viable.
Yeah,
it might be, but again, it's pretty complicated. So there are some other things we can do. We can jump in here.
So Howard, I'm not going to make the decision, for you, but do want to share just what that timeline has looked like for some folks. Is that an elevation project that we worked with FEMA. The work occurred 2018. And Stephanie and I just closed out the project last December, and not December 2022, the December that just happened, 2023. And for that entire time, the homeowner had fronted the cost, of more than $200,000. So FEMA, as you said, is always a difficult process. The elevation process is one of the most difficult FEMA processes. That said, I completely understand, the historic value of your home, why you're considering that. But I do want anybody who is considering an elevation to go into it with kind of open eyes about the timeline, and the amount that you might need to, put up front. Whereas the buyout is, you are waiting in that black box, but once you get out of that black box, the closing can happen very quickly, and you can have, the money in front of you. Open questions sometimes of whether that money is enough to find someplace else in the community. I recognize that is another factor.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I just wanted to. Sorry, Greg, go ahead.
Go ahead. Just one last question, I promise. So I heard earlier there was a mention of the 100-year mark. Now, is that a part of the criteria? Because there's a 100-year mark and there's a 300-year mark, and we live past the trailer park by the river, and we are above the 100-year mark, but we got hit pretty hard in July. And so would that 100-year mark be a part of the criteria that FEMA is using to be able to make decisions on whether or not people are approved, or is that just something that was just brought up?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So FEMA, we can do buyouts with FEMA outside of the special flood hazard area, which is that 100-year mark that you're talking about. FEMA makes it complicated. That's the theme. It's a lot harder to do buyouts that are outside of the special flood hazard area. So for the last couple of years, we've had funding in a state program called the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, which was funded through the American Rescue Plan Act. So it was temporary money. And the focus of that program, the highest priority was doing buyouts that we couldn't do with FEMA funding. And our flood risk in Vermont is different than how FEMA categorizes flood risk. I won't get into the details of that, but it's different. So it means we experience flooding outside of that zone in Vermont regularly. So the bad news is the program's out of money. So the program, we obligated the rest of the funding under the Flood Resilient Communities Fund in December. The legislature is talking about it, what future iteration of that program is going to look like. We don't have an answer. We won't until they finish the session in May and have a budget that gets approved. So it's possible there will be additional money under that program. We were willing to continue accepting applications, especially for buyouts that flooded in July, because we want to have them ready to go. So if we do get additional funding approved, we could submit them immediately. And that program, because it's a state program, it doesn't involve FEMA. It's a lot faster. We've tried to remove as much of the administrative burden as we can. So it wouldn't be a bad thing if funding was available to end up in that program, but it's specifically for projects that are not FEMA eligible.
Thanks, Stephanie. That would be something that if you wanted to use Dan Noy's chat and Q&A with all the different legislators, if you wanted to write them and say, hey, refunding this pot of funding would be important, feel free to use that information to write that email and make that phone call. I know I have a couple times.
Like Seth, I'm not in a
Thank you so
position
much. That's great.
Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
Sorry.
I was just saying thanks. I mean, this tonight was very informative for us.
Good. All right, folks, we have about 10 minutes left. If there's other questions, feel free to unmute yourself or pop your question in the Q&A. If not, what the next steps will be is I will make sure that this recording gets sent. Oh, Jay, go ahead, please.
Well, that was an accident, Sarah, but while I'm unmuted, I really appreciate all of your time and candor and kindness tonight. So thank you for everything.
Happy to do it. Any other questions? So I know it's a lot to absorb. So if there's other questions as you go back into your life and you kind of start thinking about it, or talking to folks in your household and your family, what I will do is as a follow-up to this, everybody who's on this and kind of out in the community at large, I'll make sure that you have the contact information for all of us that are on this, so you can reach out. We will also be in touch between Tom and Stephanie and Brian and Seth to try to figure out some times and dates to have folks in the community, and that we will communicate that out as well. And if you don't already have the application materials and wanted to start looking at those, email me and I will make sure you get that so you can start looking through it and kind of seeing how overwhelming or not overwhelming it's going to be for you if you start looking at them. So those are kind of some of the next steps. If there's other next steps that you need, don't hesitate to reach out. I hope the one big message you took away, besides FEMA is complicated and challenging, is that we're here to help you guys through this process should you choose to do so. It's important to all of us to make sure you have the support you need as you go through this process.
So
Yeah,
Sarah, what is your email?
It is learn, Learn, at uwlamoille.org. If I could figure out how to put my phone number, I will just tell my phone number out loud for everybody. It's 802-730-9513. And I feel free to write that email, give me a call, text me. I will send out to all the emails that are on this tonight. I will send out that same exact piece of information with Seth and Stephanie's information and Brian's information as well.
Thank you very much. It was most informative.
Good, I'm glad. Any other questions?
I just wanted to say to everybody, FEMA is hard, right? Like, let's just accept it with two eyes open going into this. Everybody who works for FEMA is responsible to the taxpayers, just like we are responsible to you guys as representatives. And so they're not being difficult to be difficult. It's they're answering to larger audits, a cost recovery team, our cost recovery program. And so they have to check the boxes just like we do, and and really lean on us as much as you're willing, because we can help get those boxes checked. In dealing with the library and the municipal building, I can tell you there's a lot of boxes to check. And doing it once right makes the process so much easier. And we all have hope and we have a process, right? You got flooded and we have a way forward, and we just have to do it together and get through it. And that's what's most important. So FEMA might be difficult, but they're there for you and they're gonna get you through this process. And all the troubles along the way, if you could go back to what Dan Noy has put out earlier, those representatives, write down those numbers. Your story is like the voice the legislature needs to hear for change. All of us can stand in, as an official to stand in front of the legislature. Of course, I'm going to speak out for the people, right? But your voice is so much more powerful than anyone else's. So if you're willing to share your story, that's what's going to make the process easier the next time around. So please reach out to Dan or those other representatives, and then reach out to us to help you with the process.
Hey, Jay, I see your point. What I'll do is I'll add all the representative contact information to the email I send out, because for some reason whatever I post doesn't seem to be getting to you. So I will just send it out in an email. Thanks for letting me know.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, and while we're thanking people, I just want to say thank you, Tom, for being so flexible and willing to participate in this process, and to the town of Johnson. Brian and I have been on a lot of these calls with a lot of towns since July, and they're not all, it's a hard decision for the town to make to let these go forward, and we appreciate that you guys are willing to go on this journey with all of us, so thank you.
Yep. And I just want to say thank you to everybody all the panelists who showed up. Really appreciate last minute coming together to support residents. Everybody who showed up tonight to listen in and ask questions and try to help, understand this process a little more. Thank you. Thank you for trusting us to help you through this process. So really appreciate it.
Wonderful.
Okay. If there's not any more questions, I'm going to let you guys go back to your regularly scheduled programming on the evening, and appreciate your time. Thank you so very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. We'll be in touch.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.